The street was quiet in Wilmington that afternoon. The kind of quiet that makes you lower your voice without realizing it. A handful of houses, a narrow sidewalk, and a man in a wheelchair rolling forward, carrying his whole life in a backpack on his lap. His name was Jeremy McDole, 30 years old, paralyzed from the waist down, known in the neighborhood for his jokes, his stubborn optimism, and the way he refused to let the chair define him. But to the people watching from a distance, Jeremy wasn't a neighbor. He was a call, a report, a silhouette framed by fear. This is where the story tightens its grip, because everything that follows hinges on a split-second assumption. The call to police said there was a man with a gun. No name, no confirmation, just a description vague enough to swallow anyone who fit it. And Jeremy, rolling down the street, fit it well enough for suspicion to bloom. He had a pellet gun tucked into his backpack, something he used for protection in a neighborhood where protection often felt like a luxury. The gun never left the bag, but the idea of it had already left the dispatcher's mouth. When officers arrived, the power imbalance was instant and absolute. Blue lights, raised voices, commands that came fast and stacked on top of each other. Jeremy stopped rolling. He raised his hands. He did what people are told to do when they want to live. Drop the gun. I don't have it in my hands. Drop it. Here's the cruel irony. Jeremy couldn't comply the way they expected. He was seated. His movement was limited. The commands didn't bend to his reality, and his reality didn't slow their fear. Neighbors would later say they heard panic in his voice. Not aggression. Panic. He tried to explain. He tried to breathe. He tried to exist inside a moment that was already rushing past him. Then the shots rang out. Multiple rounds. Fired into a man who couldn't stand. A man who couldn't run. A man who never lifted a weapon. Jeremy McDole slumped forward in his wheelchair as the street exploded with noise and confusion. When it was over, the silence returned. But it was different now. He was dead before the ambulance arrived. In the immediate aftermath, the narrative hardened quickly. Police statements emphasized fear. The word threat was repeated until it felt heavier than the truth. The pellet gun in the backpack became the centerpiece, as if proximity alone could justify what happened. Jeremy's disability faded into the background, an inconvenient detail in a story already written. But here's where the underdog's story refuses to stay buried. Jeremy had a family, a mother who knew the sound of his laugh, friends who knew the patience it took for him to navigate a world not built for wheels, a community that knew he wasn't a monster. He was a man. And as body camera footage surfaced, cracks began to spread through the official version. The video didn't show a man charging officers. It showed a man confused and terrified, hands raised, voice shaking. It showed commands coming fast, overlapping, impossible. It showed the distance between fear and fact, and how deadly that distance can be. Public pressure mounted. Protests filled the streets. People held signs with Jeremy's name written in thick black letters, as if writing it bigger could bring him back. An inquest was announced. For the first time, the power dynamic shifted. The story was no longer told solely by those with badges. It was being questioned by those with memories. Inside the courtroom, Jeremy's life was reduced to seconds of footage and technical language. But outside, his humanity grew louder. Witnesses spoke. Experts dissected timelines. And the wheelchair, the symbol everyone had tried to ignore, became impossible to overlook. This was the major shift. Not a verdict yet, not closure, but accountability entering the room. When the inquest concluded, it ruled the shooting unjustified. It wasn't a conviction. It didn't carry prison time. But it was something the system rarely offered families like Jeremy's. An official acknowledgement that what happened was wrong. For many watching, it felt like justice had finally leaned in the right direction, even if it didn't go far enough. Because justice, in cases like this, is often incomplete by design. The officers involved would later face a trial that ended in acquittal. The legal system drew a hard line between moral clarity and legal consequence. And once again, Jeremy's family was asked to carry the weight of that difference. Yet the story didn't end in silence. Jeremy McDole's name became a reference point, a warning, a lesson etched into public memory. That profiling doesn't just misjudge, it kills. That power, when mixed with fear, demands scrutiny. And that disability does not equal danger, no matter how fast assumptions try to make it so. The life lesson cuts deep and uncomfortable, because it asks us to question who gets the benefit of the doubt, and who pays the price when doubt is replaced with force. But here's the cliffhanger that refuses to let this rest. Because while the case closed on paper, the ripple effects did not. Policies began to shift. Training protocols were questioned. And families across the country started asking the same question Jeremy's mother still asks today. How many more names are we about to learn? In part 2, we'll go deeper into the trial, the acquittal, and the haunting question that lingers long after the cameras shut off. If the system admits something was unjustified, why does accountability so often stop there? Stay with us. The truth doesn't end where the headlines do. The courtroom didn't feel like a place built for truth. It felt like a place built for endurance. Wooden benches polished by decades of waiting, fluorescent lights humming overhead, and a family seated together, bracing themselves for a second loss. Jeremy McDole was already gone, but now his name was about to be tested, measured, debated, and weighed against procedure. This was the phase the headlines rarely linger on, where outrage cools and the system takes over, slow and methodical, as if time itself might soften what happened. Prosecutors spoke of reasonableness, of split-second decisions, of fear under pressure. Defense attorneys leaned hard into uncertainty, repeating the same quiet implication. That fear, once felt, excuses almost anything. Jeremy's wheelchair was mentioned, but rarely centered. His paralysis was acknowledged, then brushed past, like a footnote that complicated the narrative too much. The officers took the stand and described the moment as chaos, their voices calm now, practiced, trained. They spoke about commands given, about perceived movement, about a threat that existed more in imagination than reality. And sitting there, listening, Jeremy's family realized something devastating. The trial wasn't really about Jeremy at all. It was about the limits of accountability. Outside the courthouse, supporters gathered again, holding signs, chanting his name, refusing to let the process erase the person. Inside, legal language worked like a filter, stripping emotion from the facts. The jury watched the body camera footage on a large screen over and over, slowing it down, speeding it up, pausing on frames where everything blurred into pixels. Was his hand moving? Was it reaching? Was it enough? That question, was it enough, hung over every second. Expert witnesses testified about police training, about threat assessment, about how officers are taught to control situations before they spiral. But no one could explain how a man in a wheelchair, hands raised, became an unstoppable danger. And yet, the defense didn't need to prove Jeremy was dangerous. They only needed to prove the officers felt he might be. That was the loophole. That was the quiet power shift no one talked about. Fear, once validated, outweighed consequence. Days passed. Closing arguments were delivered with rehearsed gravity. The jury left to deliberate, carrying Jeremy's final moments with them into a room where the world outside ceased to exist. When they returned, the air felt thinner. Not guilty. The words landed without drama, without pause. Just 2 words, heavy enough to hollow out a room. Jeremy's mother didn't scream. She didn't collapse. She just stared forward, absorbing the truth the system had delivered. That an unjustified killing could still be legally acceptable. That justice, as defined here, had limits she was never told about. Outside, the reaction was immediate. Anger surged. Grief reignited. For many watching, this wasn't just about Jeremy McDole anymore. It was about pattern, precedent, and permission. Permission for profiling. Permission for fear to outrank restraint. Permission for power to protect itself. But here's the part that rarely makes it into sound bites. Even in acquittal, the case changed things. Departments across the country were forced into uncomfortable conversations about disability awareness, about communication, about slowing down instead of escalating. Policies were reviewed. Training manuals were rewritten. None of it brought Jeremy back. But none of it happened without his name. And that's the bitter irony. Real change often comes only after irreversible loss. His family filed civil suits, pushing where criminal courts had stopped. Settlements followed. Official statements were issued, carefully worded, legally cautious, but quietly acknowledging failure. It wasn't the justice people wanted, but it was the justice the system was willing to give. And still, the question lingered like an open wound. Why must families fight this hard just to have the truth acknowledged? Jeremy McDole became more than a victim. He became a case study, a reference point, a reminder that vulnerability does not guarantee protection. His story exposed how quickly society equates difference with danger, how disability can be erased the moment fear enters the room. The life lesson sharpens here, uncomfortable and unavoidable. Justice is not automatic, and power rarely corrects itself without pressure. Silence protects systems, not people. And the cliffhanger remains unresolved, because the story didn't end with the verdict or the settlement. Somewhere tonight, another call will come in. Another vague description. Another assumption. And the same question waits at the edge of the next headline. Has anything truly changed, or are we still counting names after the fact? In Part 3, we'll follow the ripple effect beyond Jeremy's case, into the policies, the promises, and the haunting reality of whether reform can outrun repetition, or whether justice will once again arrive only after it's too late. Long after the courtroom emptied and the cameras packed up, Jeremy McDole's name stayed behind. It lingered in policy meetings, in training rooms, in whispered conversations between officers who knew the case by heart but never said it out loud. This is the quiet phase of tragedy, the part that doesn't trend, doesn't chant, doesn't march, yet carries the weight of whether anything truly changes. For Jeremy's family, there was no clean break. Grief doesn't recognize verdicts. It seeps into ordinary moments, into empty chairs at family gatherings, into the instinct to reach for a phone and then remember there's no one to answer. But they refused to let his story be archived as just another file number. They spoke at forums, at universities, at city council meetings where the microphones crackled and the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Each time his mother told the story, she emphasized the detail everyone once ignored. Jeremy couldn't stand, couldn't run, couldn't lunge. She said his name slowly, deliberately, as if daring the room to forget him again. Departments responded the only way institutions know how, with language. New guidelines, revised protocols, phrases like de-escalation, disability awareness, and time and distance began appearing in official documents. On paper, it looked like progress. Officers were instructed to slow encounters, to recognize mobility limitations, to adapt commands to the person in front of them rather than forcing everyone into the same mold. Training videos were updated. Scenarios were reenacted with actors in wheelchairs, meant to teach empathy through simulation. But here's the uneasy truth. Policy changes don't automatically rewire instinct. Fear still moves faster than training. And Jeremy's case became the example instructors used when explaining what happens when that fear goes unchecked. Some officers listened. Others folded their arms and dismissed it as an anomaly. A rare tragedy, not a reflection. That divide between learning and defensiveness became the real battleground. Community members watched closely, skeptical but hopeful. Body cameras were now more common, a technological promise of transparency. Yet people learned that footage doesn't speak for itself. It still has to be interpreted, argued over, framed. Jeremy's video had shown confusion and panic. And still it wasn't enough to secure accountability. That realization cut deep. If that footage couldn't protect him, what would? Activists began tying Jeremy's name to broader demands. Clearer use of force standards, independent prosecutors, mandatory disability response training. His story traveled beyond Wilmington, referenced in panels and reports, cited in discussions about how marginalized bodies are perceived as threats. The underdog narrative expanded, no longer just about one man, but about a system that struggles to see humanity when power feels challenged. And then came the stories that echoed his. Different cities, different names, different circumstances, but the same pattern. Each time, Jeremy's case resurfaced in conversations like a grim measuring stick. "Remember what happened to the man in the wheelchair?" people would say. It became shorthand for a question no one wanted to answer. How low is the bar for lethal fear? For Jeremy's family, that repetition was both painful and purposeful. It meant his death wasn't forgotten, but it also meant it wasn't unique. They lived in that contradiction, carrying pride and sorrow in equal measure. Civil settlements provided financial relief, but money doesn't translate into safety or closure. It simply marks an acknowledgement that harm occurred, without ever fully naming who is responsible. The life lesson sharpens here. Justice in America often comes in fragments. A ruling here, policy there, a promise to do better without a mechanism to ensure it happens. Change is slow, and the people most affected are asked to be patient with systems that weren't patient with them. Yet something else was happening beneath the surface. New recruits entered academies already familiar with Jeremy McDole's name, not as a footnote, but as a cautionary tale. Instructors paused the footage and asked hard questions. What else could have been done? What assumptions were made? What role did disability, race, and environment play in how the threat was perceived? For the first time, some of those rooms fell silent. Not defensive, but reflective. That silence mattered. It meant the ripple was still moving. Still, the cliffhanger refuses to resolve neatly. Because for every step forward, another incident threatened to pull everything backward. Each new headline tested whether lessons had been learned or merely memorized. Jeremy's story hovered over those moments like a ghost, asking the same question again and again. Did we slow down, or did we default to fear? The power shift that began with public scrutiny was real, but fragile. It depended on vigilance, on communities refusing to look away once the immediate outrage faded. It depended on remembering that underdogs don't need to be perfect to deserve life. They need systems willing to see them fully. As this chapter closes, the tension remains unresolved. Jeremy McDole's name is etched into policy and memory, but whether it's etched into instinct is still uncertain. In Part 4, we'll confront the hardest truth of all, the gap between knowing better and doing better, and what it will take to close it before another life becomes another lesson learned too late. By the time Jeremy McDole's name became embedded in training manuals and policy discussions, a dangerous illusion had settled in. The idea that awareness alone was enough. That once a tragedy is acknowledged, once a few procedures are rewritten, the risk somehow dissolves. But systems don't change because they are informed. They change because they are forced to confront their own reflexes. And reflexes are stubborn things. In the years following Jeremy's death, departments across the country pointed to updated guidelines as evidence of progress, yet the street-level reality remained tense and unpredictable. Officers still approached calls primed for danger. Dispatch language still carried coded urgency. Man with a gun still triggered a cascade of assumptions long before context arrived. Jeremy's case had taught people what went wrong, but it hadn't yet taught them how to stop it from happening again. That gap between knowledge and action became the quiet fault line running beneath every reform effort. Advocates pressed harder, arguing that disability awareness training couldn't be a one-day seminar or a checkbox requirement. It had to be lived, practiced, internalized under stress. They pushed for dispatch reforms too, emphasizing how the first description can frame an entire encounter. Words, they argued, are not neutral. They steer outcomes. Jeremy's family listened to these debates with a mixture of hope and exhaustion. They had learned the language of reform the hard way, translating their grief into talking points just to be heard. And yet, even as they spoke, they noticed how often the burden of change rested on those already harmed. Communities were asked to educate, to empathize, to forgive, while institutions asked for time. Time, it seemed, was always available for systems but never for victims. The power imbalance Jeremy faced on the street echoed here in a different form. One side had authority and patience. The other had urgency born from loss. Still, cracks continued to appear. Civilian oversight boards gained modest authority in some cities. Independent prosecutors were discussed more openly. Body camera policies tightened. None of these measures were perfect, but together they signaled something important. The narrative was no longer fully controlled by those with the most power. Jeremy's story had helped pry that door open. Yet the irony persisted. Every reform announcement was shadowed by a new incident somewhere else, reminding everyone that progress is not linear. For officers who truly wanted to do better, Jeremy's case became a personal reckoning. Some admitted, quietly, that they had never been trained to slow down with someone who couldn't comply in conventional ways. That their instincts had been shaped around control, not communication. Those admissions rarely made headlines, but they mattered. They showed that change, when it came, was often internal before it was institutional. The lesson sharpened into something uncomfortable but necessary. Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It's about preventing it. And prevention requires humility, a quality power structures are not known for. Jeremy McDole's death exposed how easily fear can override context, how quickly a person can be reduced to a perceived threat instead of recognized as a human being with limits, needs, and dignity. That recognition cannot be automated. It has to be chosen again and again, in moments when adrenaline surges and judgment narrows. As years passed, Jeremy's name continued to surface in classrooms, courtrooms, and community halls. Younger activists who never knew him learned his story as a warning from a recent past, not distant history. They asked sharper questions, less willing to accept half answers. Why are standards for lethal force so elastic? Why does accountability stop where discomfort begins? Why is survival treated like a negotiation rather than a right? These questions didn't always receive satisfying answers, but asking them kept the pressure alive. The life lesson here is stark and unresolved. Knowing better does not guarantee doing better, and progress that isn't enforced can quietly unravel. Systems will default to what they've always done unless something stronger interrupts that momentum. Jeremy's story became one such interruption, but interruptions fade if they aren't reinforced. As this chapter closes, the tension tightens again. Because while reforms inch forward, the conditions that led to Jeremy's death, profiling, fear-based policing, uneven accountability, still exist. The cliffhanger isn't about whether people understand what went wrong. It's about whether understanding will be enough the next time an officer faces a vulnerable person and a split-second decision. In Part 5, we'll confront the final question Jeremy's story leaves behind, a question that determines whether his name becomes a turning point or just another reminder carved into memory after it's already too late. Years after Jeremy McDole was killed, his name still carries weight, not because the system transformed overnight, but because it didn't. That truth is the final tension of his story. Progress happened in fragments. Training modules updated, policies adjusted, conversations forced into the open. But the deeper question lingered like an echo that refused to fade. What happens when reform collides with reality? Jeremy's death became a reference point in debates about policing, disability, and profiling. Yet each new incident tested whether lessons were truly learned or merely acknowledged. For his family, time didn't soften the loss. It clarified it. They understood now that justice, as the system defines it, is often procedural rather than personal. Checks boxes, files rulings, closes cases. It rarely restores balance. And yet, they continued speaking, not because they believed words alone could fix what was broken, but because silence had already cost too much. Jeremy's mother would often say that her son wasn't perfect. He was human, and that humanity should have been enough. That statement cut through every argument, every legal defense, every explanation built on fear. Humanity, she insisted, should never be conditional. As new generations encountered Jeremy's story, something subtle but important began to shift. People no longer asked only what the officers feared. They asked what Jeremy experienced. They imagined the confusion of being shouted at, The helplessness of being unable to move fast enough. The terror of realizing that compliance might not save you. That shift in perspective mattered. It didn't rewrite the past, but it challenged the future. The power of Jeremy's story was never in spectacle. It was in its clarity. A man in a wheelchair was perceived as a threat, and that perception proved fatal. Everything else, the trials, the acquittals, the reforms, spiraled out from that moment. The life lesson here is uncomfortable because it demands responsibility from everyone, not just institutions. It asks communities to stay engaged after outrage fades. It asks voters to care about policy details, not just headlines. It asks officers to interrogate their instincts and slow down when fear urges them to speed up. And it asks society to decide whose lives are granted patience and whose are rushed toward irreversible outcomes. Jeremy McDole's story does not end with closure, because closure suggests completion, and this story is still unfolding. Somewhere, right now, another vulnerable person is navigating a world that doesn't always see them clearly. Somewhere, another officer is responding to a call shaped by limited information and inherited assumptions. The distance between those two people, the space where judgment is formed, is where Jeremy's legacy now lives. That space can be widened by empathy or collapsed by fear. The choice is made in seconds, but its consequences last generations. If justice has been served in any sense, it is not because the system punished everyone involved, but because the truth survived attempts to bury it. Jeremy McDole is remembered not as a footnote or a statistic, but as a warning and a challenge. His life insists that awareness must turn into action, that reform must be enforced, and that power must be questioned, especially when it claims to be afraid. The final cliffhanger is not about a verdict yet to come or a policy yet to be passed. It's about the next moment of decision. The next time fear rises, will someone remember Jeremy McDole? Not as a case, not as a controversy, but as a man whose life should have been protected. That answer hasn't been written yet. And until it is, his story remains unfinished, waiting on the future to decide whether it will repeat the past or finally break from it.